Hey, good morning.
Wait, no, I start off. You'll get plenty of time to talk, Rabbi.
All right.
Good morning, Adam Taxin here at Chabad of Bonita Springs, Estero, and Florida Gulf Coast University, FGCU, the Eagles, who made a nice run in the NCAA tournament a few years ago. I am with Rabbi Mendy Greenberg. There is a morning minyan here. I'm visiting this area for a few days. And today we're talking about today's Torah reading, which is from the, I guess, early to middle part of Exodus. It's Parsha Beshalach, but we're only talking about the reading for today. It's the each Torah Parsha is divided into 7 sections, one for each day of the week, fairly obviously. And today is Exodus 14, chapter 14, verse 26 through chapter 15, verse 26, about the Egyptian army being decimated at the Sea of Reeds and the Jews having a celebratory song afterwards, which wasn't really Schadenfreude, but it's basically because their lives were saved. Rabbi Greenberg, all right, tell us about.
It reminds me of the story of the child that comes home from Hebrew school, and he tells his parents what he heard, and he said, "The teacher told me that Jewish people were fleeing the Egyptians, caught between the rock and a hard place. They see the Red Sea on one side, the Egyptians on the other side. Moses is an amazing engineer. He immediately builds a bridge, they cross over, and as soon as the Jews go and the Egyptians are on the bridge, Moses blows up the bridge. And the parents look at the child and say, "Is that really what your teacher taught you?" He said, "No, but if you didn't believe that, you definitely wouldn't believe what he did."
Good one. I hadn't heard
So
that.
today's reading, of course, is about the reading, the splitting of the Red Sea, and it speaks about.
Wait. They say it's not the Red Sea; it's the Sea of Reeds. People say it's not really. It's a little further north and west than the actual Red Sea. Isn't there a dispute about
There's
whether?
actually a debate about where
Sorry
precisely
to cut you off, but
where precisely the miracle happened, what body of water, and where exactly it is beyond the scope of today's discussion. But there is a big debate about that. And whenever we read about this, it reminds me of something my grandfather would always say about the splitting of the Red Sea. You find in Talmud several places where it speaks about, for example, shidduchim, people coming together. It says, "Kashal azavkam k'kriyas yamsuf." It's difficult for God to find a match for people, just like it was difficult to split the Red Sea. And you find that several places in Talmud, as well as another interesting point about the Red Sea, something that's compared to the Red Sea, is giving livelihood. It's hard for God to find us some to give livelihood, just as it is for God to split the Red Sea. Now, isn't it interesting that it's called difficult? Why would splitting the Red Sea be difficult for God? And why would any of these other things be difficult for God either? These should be the easiest things for God to do, if there's something called easy for Hashem, because this Red Sea, in fact, it says that when God created the world, when God created the seas, it was created with that in mind. It was a stipulation that when the Jewish people come through and the Egyptians are following them, that at that point the sea would split. So it was already part of the plan. It shouldn't even be considered a miracle if you look at it from that perspective. That was part of the nature of the water. That usually it flows, but at a certain point it doesn't when the Jewish people are there. Now, when it comes to these other two things, also it says 40 days before a child comes into the world, it's already decided who that child is going to marry. So it shouldn't be difficult at all. And when it comes to parnasa, livelihood, it's already determined on Rosh Hashanah. So what's the difficulty? The difficulty for God to give us livelihood on a daily basis if it was already predetermined. So to answer those questions, he answered it with one answer, one general point. When it comes to splitting the Red Sea, it says that when the Jewish people were standing in front of the Red Sea, it didn't split so quickly. There's a whole story how Nachshon jumped in, and he had the water up to his neck, and only at that point did it jump in. And the Medrash tells us that there was actually a debate going on between the angels and God. And the angels were against the splitting of the Red Sea, saying that why should there be a miracle for these people when they're no different than the Egyptians? It says, these are idol worshippers, and these are idol worshippers. It says the Jewish people coming out of Egypt, we were no saints, we were idol worshippers. And God had to...
Wasn't it the 49th of the 50 levels of impurity? The Jews
Correct.
were that low at that
We
point.
seeped into the 49th level. Had God not taken us out immediately, we would have sunk into the 50th. That's why God had to actually chase us. Pharaoh had to chase us out of Egypt, not just we didn't leave on our own accord because we were seeped into that impurity. It also says that we had to leave in haste, because had we stayed any longer, who knows what could have happened? We could have seen, God forbid, into the 50th level of impurity.
One reason for matzah.
Another reason for matzah, correct. So at this point, God had to convince them, no. So my grandfather says that if you look at it, the angels will probably told, or the sea was probably told, that when you see, God pointed to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, when you see descendants of these three people, split for them. So the sea says, fine, that's a deal. Now when the sea sees these people, and they don't look like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, it says, these are idol worshippers. These can't be the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God has to convince the sea. So that's why it was difficult. In the same vein, when it comes to shidduchim, when it comes to finding a match, 40 days before the person is born, the person is studying the whole Torah, they're completely spiritual and godly, but when it comes time for getting married, maybe the angel doesn't recognize them at that point. And the same thing when it comes to parnasa, to livelihood, on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that's when it's being decided. So the angels are looking down and saying, oh, this guy is praying. Look what they're doing. What is everybody doing Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur? They're praying in the synagogue. The biggest saints. When it comes time to give the actual livelihood, maybe they're not recognized. So this is, of course, interesting thought, but it gives us a little perspective of how we have to go through the crossing of the Red Sea on a daily basis. We have to look at ourselves. Every day we read in the davening, in the prayers, we read the song, because we are constantly crossing this Red Sea. We're constantly crossing these obstacles that are in our way, that the seeming obstacles, they may be as vast as a sea, but they're only obstacles, and our job is to go through and sink through it, to be joy. Today's Hayom Yom spoke about that idea of serving God, using intellect, but at the same time using joy, because only joy can carry us through. And just to finish off, the whole idea of splitting the Red Sea is enigmatic. Why would God have to cause that to happen? God wanted us to be spared. There were many other ways it could have happened. Many other ways the Egyptians could have been punished, and they could have also not pursued us in the first place. What was the point of having this whole thing happen in order for the sea to split?
Given that the 10 plagues had just occurred, and the Egyptians should have been glad to get rid of the Hebrews at that point.
They could have been glad to have us gone, and we could have already been long gone and forgotten. But yet God planned this out, that they should pursue us in order that the sea should split. Of course, because that's what they've done against us on a simple level. They drowned our firstborns, and God had to punish them in the same way. But on a deeper level, what we want to focus on is this was a preparation. This was like the mikveh, getting purified.
Oh, that's a mikveh.
For getting the Torah. When we got the Torah, it wasn't just getting some wisdom, getting the Ten Commandments. Receiving the Torah on Mount Sinai was a cosmic change. Up until then, spirituality and physical life could not engage with each other. They were dichotomous, and in order for them to come together, this dichotomy to be able to work together, it had to go through this process of splitting the Red Sea, where you have on one hand it's water, on the other hand it becomes dry land. Water is the revealed part of the Torah, the things that we see revealed, or on the contrary, just the opposite. Dry land is what we walk in. We could see everything. Whereas the sea, we don't see what's beyond. We can only see the sea. We don't see all the creatures and the reefs and everything that's below. There's a whole kingdom going on there, but we don't see that.
Yeah, that's next week, right? Parsha Yisro Jethro is when we receive the Ten Commandments. And one thing, we'll talk about this more next week, wherever I am, is that it's named after Jethro, who was questionably even Jewish at any point in his life. Yet the Ten Commandments...
He converted to Judaism.
He did definitely convert to Judaism. But he's only one of 7 people mentioned who has a Torah Parsha named after him. Right. Some of whom are not very positive, like Balak. And for example, there's not one named after Moshe, but I'm really getting off course. So is it safe to say that today, not even this week, but today's Torah reading is where the Exodus per se becomes complete? Once we're on the other side of the sea and the Egyptians are drowned, we can say, okay, the Exodus has happened. We still have to obviously go through the 40 years in the desert. And
there's still the 49 days of preparation for receiving the Torah. Which
but I'm saying the Exodus, you take the Greek word. It's not even the Hebrew word.
At that point, we were already free from the Egyptian bondage.
So the Exodus has happened. We're out of Egypt today.
Correct. This would be the last day of Passover, so to say. The 7th day of Passover, or outside of Israel, the 8th day was one extra day. But the 7th day is when we read this part of the Torah, because that's at that point the holiday of Passover finishes.
And let me point out that Passover is really about 2 months from now, maybe even a little more than that right now. We're over 2 months away, but the readings in the Torah, which is over a whole year, do not fit so that you read about the Exodus right at Passover. Most of the Torah occurs in the desert, and so therefore, predictably enough, the whole time in Egypt is covered only over a few weeks. The entire time in Egypt, and we tend to read it about 2 months before Passover. Let me ask you one other thing about the death of the Egyptians. Obviously, there's a joyous song about our rescue, and one thing, if people have been to a Seder, they notice is there's a sort of sense of regret for the deaths of all the Egyptians, that they all had to die. This is different from when we spilled the wine for the plagues itself. But isn't there something in there that we should somewhat temper the celebration because so many Egyptians were slaughtered?
It was the angels who wanted to join along in song, and Hashem told them, my handiwork is drowning in the sea. How could you sing praise? So it was one thing for the Jewish people to sing praise because they were saved. Mm-hmm. There's another thing for someone who was not involved to feel the pain that at the end of the story, it's still God's creations.
Let me add one more thing before we conclude. What's interesting is, the army, there's an element of just following orders there. And the Egyptians certainly went above and beyond in being cruel to taskmasters, etc. But we're talking about the army, the young men, probably 18-year-olds in a lot of cases, or younger at that point. But interestingly, they all died in a very painful, 500 plagues way, but who did not die in all that? And he was there, Pharaoh. What's the thought? I don't know if that's mentioned or...
The Torah says, the reason says, God said, I'm going to spare you in order that you should see and my name should be exalted. If he wouldn't witness it, mm-hmm. Part of the punishment of Egypt was in order to acknowledge that God was there. Had he died, he wouldn't be able to witness that.
Any final thoughts on today's reading? Hopefully, if we have time tomorrow, we'll do something on tomorrow's reading, starting at Exodus chapter 15, verse 27. Any final thoughts you want to end with?
Final thoughts is the end of today's reading. It speaks about Miriam singing the song. It says
Miriam's Moses' sister.
Moses' sister. The difference between Miriam and Moses singing the song is that Miriam went with all the women, and not only did they sing, but they actually brought along tamarines. It says they were playing with instruments. How did they have instruments? It says the women, they already predicted that we're going to leave Egypt and a miracle is going to happen. They already prepared themselves. So that their faith, it says, and faith in the merit of the faith of the righteous woman, Nigalu b'Mitzrayim, we were redeemed from Egypt. It was in their merit. And it was chus, and it continues with chus nashim tzikanis, and in the merit of the righteous woman of today's day, we will be redeemed from the current and present exile, the coming of Mashiach.
Thank you, and I just want to give people your website to make sure I have it right. It's jewishbonita.com. This is Rabbi Mendy Greenberg from Chabad of Bonita Springs, Estero, and Florida Gulf Coast University. That's in the southwest part of Florida, between Naples and Fort Myers. Thanks for your time today.